He saved her from death, but was forced to marry her to protect her honor. Before we dive into this compelling story, we invite you to like the video and subscribe to the channel to support our work. We hope you enjoy it. A thick fog hung over the valleys as Earl Bennett's truck climbed the dirt road, winding between pine trees and frozen pastures. The sky was turning a dull shade of gray with the break of dawn, and the cold had already settled deep into everything. In the passenger seat, Nora Sullivan kept her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her fingers pressing harder than they needed to, as if she were holding back more than just discomfort. She wore a dark green wool dress, a coat too thin for that region, and worn-out boots. Ever since she had lost her parents, her mother to a fever, her father to a train accident, she had been living with her aunt and uncle. But her uncle Raymond had made it clear that he didn't intend to keep supporting her for long. He said her presence unsettled the house. Her Aunt Carol backed that up with calculated silences and glances that said more than words. When Earl showed up saying he knew someone in the mountains who could take care of the situation, Raymond simply nodded. Nora had no say in the matter. She was just told to pack a bag and go. The truck stopped at an unmarked fork in the road, where the path narrowed into a rough, gravel-covered trail buried under the snow. The wind howled through the trees, making the forest sound even farther away. Earl pointed to a barely visible path veering off to the right and said the cabin was that way. He told her to deliver an envelope and wait for further instructions. Claimed he couldn't walk her there because the engine was running hot, and he had to head back before getting stuck in the snow. He didn't offer to help with her suitcase, didn't ask if she knew where she was going. He just pulled away in the truck before she could say a word. Nora was left standing alone in the middle of nowhere, one hand clutching her suitcase, the other holding the envelope. She looked toward the trail, winding through the dense woods, and took a deep breath. Then she started walking. The snow covered everything unevenly, hiding rocks, branches, and holes beneath a fragile crust. Each step made her ankles sink, her toes numb, and the cold seeped deep into her bones. The path, clear at first, became more confusing as the trees thickened, splitting into identical-looking trails. The silence around her was so complete, her own footsteps seemed too loud. Her heart pounded, not just from exertion, but from the uncertainty. At every bend, she expected to see the cabin, but there were only trees, ice-covered stones, and more snow. After nearly an hour of walking, her chest tightened. Her breathing grew shallow, and the nausea she'd been fighting since morning twisted into a knot in her stomach. She reached for a tree trunk for support, but her fingers slipped. Her suitcase dropped, and the world spun. The faint came without warning. Her knees gave out, and she collapsed sideways into the snow. Her skin was already cold, and now, lying there, her body began to tremble involuntarily. Her damp lashes closed. The tips of her fingers lost all sensation. Everything dissolved into the white around her. That was how Jack Miller found her. He was returning from the Southern Trail, carrying firewood in his arms, when he saw something dark breaking up the snow's uniform surface, a still figure. He dropped the wood where he stood and ran. As he got closer, he recognized a young woman, pale and barely breathing, her hair clinging to her frozen skin. He crouched down, touched her gently, and got no reaction. Instinct took over. Without thinking, Jack scooped her up in his arms, pressing her head against his chest to shield her from the wind. The snow continued to fall in thin flakes, covering his shoulders, her hair, and the suitcase lying several feet behind. The walk back to the cabin was quick but tense. The wooden door slammed shut behind them, and the warmth inside clashed sharply with the bitter cold outside. Jack laid her down on his bed, pulled off her boots, wrapped her in blankets, and lit the wood stove. He boiled water, made a thick soup with what he could find in the pantry, and sat at the table without taking his eyes off her. He didn't know who she was or why she had ended up there, but something about the situation offended his sense of decency. He was furious at whoever had left her out in the mountains to fend for herself in the dead of winter. Nora came to hours later. The soft light of late afternoon poured through the window, gently warming the room. She opened her eyes slowly. The first thing she saw was the rough wooden ceiling. Then she noticed the smell of soup, the warmth of the blankets, and a man sitting quietly beside the bed. He stood as soon as he saw she was awake. He picked up the steaming mug and handed it to her, saying only, "Drink. We'll talk after." His voice was steady but not harsh. Still groggy, Nora obeyed. She sipped the soup with difficulty. She knew she was safe there for now, but she had no idea how to explain what had happened, and even less of an idea how to leave without carrying the kind of reputation the village would soon try to brand her with. Not long after eating, still exhausted to the core, she drifted into another deep sleep. The next morning, Nora woke to the sound of wind beating against the windows and the scent of coffee mingling with the faint aroma of burning wood. The room was quiet and warm, and for a moment, she couldn't tell whether she was still dreaming or if the heaviness from the previous day was simply lingering. She slowly turned her head and saw Jack near the stove, stirring something in a cast-iron pot. He wore the same flannel shirt from the day before and looked focused on his task. She sat up carefully, her legs aching. Her whole body felt sore, not just from the fainting but from the cold, the exhausting walk, and the strain of being dragged from place to place without a say in where she was going. Jack noticed the movement and glanced briefly over his shoulder. He said nothing, just poured coffee into 2 mugs and placed one on the small table beside the bed. Nora wrapped her hands around the mug and murmured a quiet thank you. The warmth of the coffee traveled through her, reminding her that, for now, she was safe. Her fingers began to thaw, her chest felt less tight, and her thoughts started to organize themselves. Jack sat at the far end of the table, elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasping his mug. His eyes didn't meet hers directly, but he was clearly watching her every move. She finished her coffee in silence, and in a hoarse voice, said she needed to explain. She told him she had been sent there by Earl Bennett, said she didn't know exactly why, only that he'd stopped the truck near a trail, pointed toward the cabin, and told her to follow it. She mentioned the envelope she carried, but didn't show it. She explained that she had been left alone in the snow and, after walking aimlessly for a while, had collapsed from exhaustion. The last thing she remembered was the cold reaching deep into her bones and the sound of snow crunching beneath her steps. Jack listened quietly, not interrupting, not reacting. When she finished, he stood and returned to the stove, turning his back as if needing a moment to compose himself. She used the pause to discreetly check the inside of her blouse, making sure the letter was still there. The envelope was folded, dry, and warm against her skin. She felt the paper through the fabric and pressed her lips together, unsure if giving it to him would solve anything or just make things worse. When Jack returned with a bowl of porridge, she accepted it with a small nod. She ate slowly, without real hunger. While chewing, she asked about her suitcase, said she'd left it on the trail and hadn't seen it anywhere in the cabin. Jack confirmed with a quiet gesture. He hadn't brought it. At the time, his only concern had been getting her out of the snow before she lost consciousness. He said it might still be there, unless some animal had gotten to it. The answer hit hard. Nora nodded, even though nearly everything she had was in that suitcase. A few changes of clothes, her documents, a wooden comb, a book that had belonged to her mother. She didn't ask if they'd go back for it. She could tell by his tone that it wasn't a priority. She stared at her bowl for a few seconds, then pushed it aside. Jack cleared the dishes and returned to the sink. He said they would head down the mountain once the sun had risen enough to soften the road. They were isolated but not trapped, and the sooner they ended this situation, the better for both of them. His tone wasn't harsh, but there was an urgency to it, the kind of urgency that comes from someone trying to regain control of his own space. Nora remained quiet after that. She stayed near the stove, warming her hands, trying to bring order to the chaos in her mind. She still didn't know what to do with the letter, or if it even mattered. Jack didn't seem like the kind of man who cared much for messages written by others. And if the note said what she feared, a deal, a trade, some kind of bargain, it might be better to keep it to herself until she understood what was really going on. When he left to check the road conditions, she took the opportunity to stand up more steadily. Her head still felt a little heavy, but she could walk. She straightened the blanket on the bed, put on her coat slowly, and stood by the window, watching the snow start to melt on the higher branches. Neither of them said another word until it was time to leave. Jack returned, picked up the car keys, and nodded toward the door. Nora brushed her fingers along the collar of her blouse, making sure once more that the letter was still there. She stepped out of the cabin with steady steps, even though she had no idea what waited at the end of the road. And Jack, as he locked the door behind them, wore the expression of someone who already knew this story wouldn't end with that descent. By the time Nora reached her aunt and uncle's front door, she could still feel the cold from the past hours clinging to her legs. She knocked with a trembling hand, more from instinct than hope. The door swung open suddenly, as if they'd been waiting for her. Raymond stood in the doorway, coat still on, his face closed off, his eyes tired but sharp. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't say a word of welcome. He simply stood in the doorway, blocking any attempt to enter. "Did you deliver the letter?" he asked, his tone sharp and cold. Nora flinched at the sound of his voice. She swallowed hard, crossed her arms over her chest, and said no. Raymond tilted his head, gave a slow shake, and for a moment looked like he might hold back the frustration on his face. "Then it's done. You spent the night in a widower's house. You're not coming back in here." She tried to explain, said she fainted in the snow, had no choice, that she'd been rescued. But he raised his voice, not to shout, but to cut off any further explanation. "You were sent there for a reason. Don't pretend to be surprised. Everyone's already talking. And were they supposed to think about me, about Carol, about this house, after all that?" Nora stood frozen. In his tone and in his words, she saw it clearly for the first time. Everything had been planned. The isolated trail, the lack of information, the way Earl rushed off after dropping her. None of it had been accidental. And now, with no way to return, no place to go, she stood at the center of a decision she'd never made. Raymond looked at her one last time, unmoved. "Talk to the pastor. The decision's is now." And he slammed the door shut. Nora stood motionless for a few seconds until the cutting wind forced her to move. She stepped down the porch steps, her feet heavy, crossed the street barely noticing the stairs, and walked the path that led to Pastor Hardrose's house. The sky had begun to darken, and the village moved slowly under the evening chill, with lit windows, half-open doors, and muffled voices inside the homes. The door to the parsonage was already open, and Hargrove himself greeted her with a calm gesture, as if he'd been expecting her. They sat at the table. He listened to everything without interrupting. Nora told him about the trail, about fainting, about taking shelter in the cabin. She mentioned the letter, but said she hadn't delivered it. Said Jack had treated her with respect, that nothing inappropriate had happened. When she finished, the pastor stayed silent for a few moments, then laced his fingers together on the table. "It's not about what happened," he said, "but about what people believe happened. And around here, a few careless words are all it takes to stain someone's name for life." Nora nodded slowly. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She only asked what would happen now. The pastor replied that he and Raymond would speak with Jack, that it was only fair to hear his side. But among the village men, he added, that conversation likely wouldn't change the outcome. The next morning, Raymond's car climbed the icy road to the cabin with difficulty. The pastor sat quietly in the passenger seat. Jack was outside splitting wood when he heard the engine. He didn't look surprised. He wiped his hands on a cloth at his waist and walked toward them. The pastor greeted him respectfully, and Jack returned the gesture with restraint. Raymond, on the other hand, got straight to the point. "You know why we're here?" Jack nodded. The pastor asked him to explain what had happened. Jack spoke clearly. He described finding Nora unconscious on the trail, how he brought her inside, warmed her, fed her, and brought her back down as soon as she was able. He made it clear that nothing had happened beyond what was necessary, that there had been no intention, no attachment. The pastor listened, glanced at Raymond, then looked down at the ground. He sighed deeply. "Even so, the rumors have already spread. She spent the night in your home. She was seen getting out of your truck on a main road. We can't control what people think, but we can protect what's left of her reputation." Jack didn't respond at first, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Then he asked, "So you're telling me I have to marry someone I barely know to fix a mistake that wasn't mine?" Raymond folded his arms. "You made a choice when you took her in. Now you're part of the consequence." Jack took a step back. He felt the urge to refuse, to slam the door, to declare he owed no one anything. But he thought of Nora's pale face, the way she drank the broth without question, her quiet thank you, the lost look in her eyes the next morning. He nodded slowly, not with enthusiasm or resistance, but with the acceptance of someone who knows that sometimes there is no right choice. "If she agrees, I'll marry her." The pastor nodded with solemn respect. Raymond said nothing, as if the outcome felt smaller than expected. They returned to the village in silence, and Jack stayed behind, staring at the empty trail, knowing that soon the cabin would no longer be just his. Later that same afternoon, the pastor returned to Nora's aunt and uncle's house. Aunt Carol led her in only for the conversation, staying close by, as if watching over something fragile that might explode at any moment. Nora sat at the edge of the sofa, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her fingers pressing into each other with force. The pastor settled into the armchair across from her, removed his hat, and rested it on his knee, looking at her with a mix of compassion and pragmatism. He said he had spoken with Jack, that they'd heard his side, and now it was her turn to decide. He added that he understood how unfair the situation was, but that given how quickly the story had spread through the village, there was no other way to repair the damage without causing even more harm. "If you agree, I can perform the wedding later this week. It'll be simple, but enough to settle the matter." Nora listened without lifting her head. The letter was still tucked under her clothing, carefully folded, warmed by her skin, but forgotten amid everything that had become more urgent. Whatever was written inside felt irrelevant now, swallowed up by the course of events. She asked if Jack had really agreed. The pastor nodded. He said Jack hadn't wanted it, but hadn't refused either. Said he wasn't reluctant, just reasonable. "He won't turn his back on you, Nora. That, at least, I can assure you." The pastor's voice was steady but kind, and Nora, tired of having her fate decided by others, stared at the floor for a long time before giving her answer. "All right, I accept." By the next day, news of the wedding had spread through the village faster than the facts that led to it. The shops, the bakery, the barber shop, all were buzzing with hushed but steady conversation. Some were surprised. Others said they had expected it. Many didn't believe she had any choice in the matter. Few wondered how Jack felt, and almost no one seemed to care what Nora wanted. Pastor Hargrove handled everything discreetly. He said it would be a small ceremony, just witnesses and the necessary blessing. Aunt Carol prepared a simple dress, sewn hastily from an old pattern found in the attic. There were no flowers, no music, no celebration. Only what was essential: legality and silence. Raymond didn't show up. Neither did Earl, which, in many ways, said more than if they had. Jack arrived at the church without rush, wearing clean clothes and his usual dark coat. His hair was combed back, his face freshly shaved, and his expression unreadable, neither resentful nor pleased. Nora waited at the altar, eyes lowered, shoulders drawn in beneath the modest fabric. When he approached, he said nothing, just stood beside her. The pastor began the ceremony with few words. He spoke of responsibility, companionship, and rebuilding. There were no vows, only quiet affirmations. When the pastor asked Jack if he took Nora as his wife, he answered yes with a steady voice. When it was her turn, she did the same without hesitation. And so, with 2 words and a handshake, they were declared husband and wife. After the ceremony, they left the church in silence. There were no guests, no receiving line, just a small group of townspeople standing at a distance, watching with thinly veiled curiosity. Jack glanced once in their direction, then turned to Nora and said he'd take her home. She nodded. The drive to the cabin was quiet, not for lack of things to say, but because nothing they could say would change what had just happened. When they arrived, he opened the door and waited for her to go in. The cabin hadn't changed, but the air inside felt different. Jack hung his coat behind the door and asked if she'd like some tea. Nora said yes, though her voice barely came out. She sat near the fireplace, in the same place she had been days before, and watched him light the fire like someone restarting something that had been left undone. That night, they slept under the same roof again, but now as husband and wife. Jack laid out a bedroll near the fireplace and told her she could take the bed. Nora didn't argue. She simply lay down in silence, listening to the crackle of the flames and letting the warmth gradually reach her. She knew that despite the title they now shared, she was still a stranger in that space. There was a gulf between them, of unsaid words and undefined intentions. But she also knew that, for the first time in days, no one was pointing a finger at her. No one was demanding anything. And in that wooden quiet, surrounded by wind and firelight, she began to realize that maybe her real life wasn't meant to begin in the village, but here. The next day began with a clear sky and biting air. Nora woke before the fire in the hearth had completely died out. She heard the sound of Jack's boots outside, his steady footsteps crunching over the snow, the creak of firewood being stacked. Inside, the cabin remained quiet, warmed only by the lingering heat from the night. She got up slowly, pulled the coat around her shoulders, and went to the window. The field beyond was white and untouched, sunlight glinting gently off the frozen surface. She took a deep breath. She was no longer a guest. She was a wife. And even if the words still felt unfamiliar on her lips and in her movements, the fact itself was undeniable. In the kitchen, she found a bit of coffee still warm in the kettle. She poured herself a cup in silence and sat at the table, her hands wrapped around the mug for warmth. Jack returned shortly after, bringing in more wood. He took off his coat and gave a quiet nod in greeting. She replied just as softly. They exchanged few words. Neither one quite knew how to behave. They had already spent time under the same roof, but now there was a different weight between them. Longer glances, heavier silences, a cohabitation that no longer felt temporary. Jack warmed some bread on the stove, shared it with her, and then stepped out again to break the ice at the well. Nora used the time alone to straighten the bedroom, fold the blanket, and organize the few clothes she had managed to retrieve from Carol before the ceremony. While tidying her things, she found the envelope tucked into the lining of her coat. She paused, It had been with her since the trail. She'd never handed it over, never opened it. For some reason, she had treated that piece of paper as something dangerous, a symbol of a fate imposed on her. But now, alone in a room that was hers only out of obligation and lack of choice, Nora felt she had to know. She sat on the edge of the bed and with steady fingers broke the seal. Inside, nothing. No note, no instructions, no message, just emptiness. She stared for a moment, unblinking, and then it became clear. The letter had never existed. There had never been anything to deliver. She had been sent to the cabin like a package, a problem being passed off. The so-called letter was just a wrapper to make it all seem legitimate. She tucked the envelope back in her pocket and made her way to the kitchen with measured steps. Jack was at the door, scooping ice from a bucket. When he saw her, he noticed something different in her expression, something steadier, calmer. She approached him and held out the envelope. He took it with a wary look, opened it, and found the same thing she had. Nothing. He stared inside as if waiting for something to appear. There was nothing in it, she said. It was just a way to send me to you. Jack kept his eyes on the paper for a long moment, then closed his fingers around it and nodded slowly. I'm not surprised, he said. Raymond doesn't seem like someone who cares how things happen, as long as the outcome suits him. She crossed her arms, trying to hold down the mix of humiliation and relief. I thought maybe there'd be something in it. A reason, a direction, something to tell me what I was supposed to do. Jack looked at her. They sent you here to create a story. The town took care of the rest. Nora nodded. And now we're here. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that comes from understanding something deeply without needing to spell out. Jack turned back to the kitchen, opened the cold stove, and dropped the envelope inside. He struck a match, and the flames rose slowly, consuming the empty paper like a chapter that had never made sense to begin with. The rest of the day passed in quiet cooperation. They worked together around the cabin. Nora swept the floor, mended a dishcloth, sorted the dry wood from the damp. Jack fixed the back door hinge, cleaned his tools, checked the stove's ventilation. It was a simple routine, practical and calm. They didn't speak much, but there was a kind of shared rhythm between them that made the space feel lighter. At dusk, he asked if she wanted to walk to the stream. He said the snow was thinner in that part of the woods. Nora said yes. They walked side by side in silence. And along that short path between pine trees and frozen gravel, hands in their pockets, their footsteps falling in sync, something new began to take shape. It wasn't affection. It wasn't yet closeness. But it was a mutual presence, a quiet acknowledgement that maybe, given time, it could become something neither of them yet dared to define. The days that followed settled into a quiet, austere routine, shaped by snow, persistent cold, and Jack's silent habits. Nora still woke early, even without need. She usually got up before the sun reached the bedroom window, slid on her boots while her feet were still numb, and made coffee with steady hands, even when her heart refused to beat in rhythm. The cabin was small, but it followed its own logic. Every item had its place, every object its use. And though Jack made no outward gestures of welcome, she could tell he was offering her space in his own quiet way. He didn't set boundaries, but he didn't draw near either. It was as if the marriage had been signed on paper, but left untouched in practice. In the village, the tone of the gossip had shifted. The whispers no longer carried suspicion, but resignation. Nora was now Jack Miller's wife. That's what people said. And because of that, the judgment had dulled. The village had already had its scandal, its story to chew on for weeks. Now it moved on, returning to its small cycles of Sunday services, markets, modest weddings, and expected births. No one sought her out. No one called her back. And little by little, she stopped looking behind her. The life she'd known under her uncle's roof, with its disapproving glances and constant scrutiny, now felt like an old chapter that didn't belong to mornings of chopped wood and bread warming over the stove. Jack kept his rhythm unchanged. He spent most of the day outdoors, returning with snow on his shoulders, red hands, and eyes always scanning the sky and the trail's condition. At night, he read a different book every 2 or 3 days, taken from a small wooden box he kept beside the fireplace. He never talked about what he was reading, never offered the books to her. But Nora began to watch him with curiosity. The way he turned the pages, how his brow furrowed when something caught him, how he always left the bookmark on the 3rd page of a chapter, as if waiting for something that never came. One night, she broke the silence. She asked what he was reading. He answered with a simple title, then added that she could keep it there if she wanted to try. And he left it for her. She read, little by little, sometimes seated near the stove, sometimes curled up on the bed. She read like someone rebuilding something. The words filled spaces that had once been silent, and when she returned a book, Jack would simply grab another and place it beside her, no comments needed. That quiet gesture became a kind of routine between them, one that didn't need to be spoken aloud. For the first time since being left on that trail, Nora felt like she could choose something, even if it was only what to read. One afternoon, while washing cloths in the basin outside, she heard Jack say he'd be heading into the village the next day. He needed oil, tools, provisions. He asked if she wanted anything. Nora shook her head, then added, hesitantly, that a comb would be nice if he could find one. She had left hers in the suitcase. He nodded. The next morning, he left early, drove the car halfway, and walked the rest, as he usually did when the path was unstable. He was gone for hours. When he returned, he carried a sack of supplies, a bottle of oil, some newspapers wrapped around tools, and a simple wooden comb wrapped in a cloth. He handed it to her without meeting her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, Nora smiled. The smile was subtle, but Jack noticed. He didn't return it with another smile, but with a gesture, he dropped the tools on the porch and went to fetch more firewood, as if the moment called for retreat, for a little more quiet. That night, she used the comb carefully. She sat by the window, gently pulling it through her damp hair, and stayed there for a long time. The feel of the wood gliding over her scalp felt like some kind of healing. Across the room, Jack pretended to read, but didn't turn the page. The fire burned low. Outside, the snow kept falling in silence. And inside that still cold cabin, 2 strangers had started to share more than just a roof. They shared time, and slowly, they also began to share the weight of being where neither had chosen, but where, for reasons neither could quite name, they no longer felt so misplaced. Winter still held firm in the mountains, but life inside the cabin was beginning to take on a different texture. The mornings were still harsh, the air remained bitterly cold, and the work was unrelenting, but something subtle had shifted in the way Nora and Jack moved through the space they now shared. They no longer avoided bumping into each other in the tight corners of the kitchen. They no longer apologized for every step. Their movements began to align without effort, and the silence that had once felt heavy now filled the house like something close to comfort. There was no declared intimacy, but there was real coexistence. Nora knew where Jack kept his keys, how he liked his coffee, the rhythm with which he sawed wood. Jack knew she preferred the linens folded by color, that she always saved a piece of bread for later, and that she read aloud when alone. That week, the snow thickened again. The sky seemed lower, the branches of the pines bent under the weight. Jack only left for what was necessary. The rest of the days were spent on indoor repairs, reading, and household chores they now tackled together. Nora had already scrubbed the cupboards, rearranged the pans, mended every towel she could find. Jack didn't comment, but he noticed. He noticed everything. One night, after they'd finished dinner, he remarked that the house felt more alive. Nora smiled with her eyes, but said nothing. She simply cleared the table, filled the basin with warm water, and began washing the utensils with slow, deliberate care. Later, while she was sewing in the armchair by the fire, Jack came over and said that they might need to go to church the following Sunday. It wasn't a request. It wasn't an obligation, but he had been invited to attend. The first service since the wedding. Nora nodded. She said she understood, but inside, the thought of returning to the village still weighed on her. She knew there would be stares, that the smiles would be measured, that the kind words would come laced with judgment. Still, she also knew she couldn't live in hiding. And more than that, she didn't want Jack to carry the responsibility of being her husband alone in front of everyone. Going wasn't about tradition. It was about dignity. On Sunday, they rose early. Nora wore one of the few dresses she'd managed to retrieve, pairing it with a scarf in her hair and a dark coat Jack had lent her. The walk to the church was quiet, but their steps were steady. When they arrived, the service was about to begin. A few heads turned. Others whispered softly, but there was no scandal, no open disapproval. They sat side by side, and Nora kept her hands folded in her lap throughout the sermon. She didn't look around. She didn't seek out familiar faces. She just listened. At the end, the pastor spoke about the value of time. He said some things cannot be built all at once, but endure because they are raised slowly with care. He didn't mention names, but many eyes turned toward the bench where Jack and Nora sat. On the way out, a few people approached them. There were brief greetings, quick glances, handshakes that felt more like social obligation than genuine welcome. But no one shunned her. No one turned away. And that, for her, was already a kind of relief. Jack quietly thanked the pastor and walked with Nora to the car without saying much. On the drive back, he asked if she was all right. She said she was. Then he mentioned that if she wanted, she could start a small garden behind the cabin in spring. She looked at him, surprised, asked if the soil was good. He said it was, and that if they took care of it, they could grow carrots, onions, maybe even some flowers. Nora thought about that all the way home. To plant, to take root, to make something grow. Back at the cabin, she took off her coat, hung it carefully, and made tea for them both. They sat by the fireplace, as they had done many times before, but there was something different in the air. The future felt like something that could be built, something that might depend only on the care they were beginning, perhaps without realizing it, to give. In the days that followed the church service, the atmosphere in the cabin began to shift in ways almost too subtle to name. There was no specific conversation, no defining moment. But something between Nora and Jack began to adjust quietly. His movements became less guarded. Hers, more relaxed. When he came back with hands marked by the axe, it was she who fetched the basin of warm water. When she spent more time in the kitchen, he would start organizing the outside area, as if the balance of that space depended on a dance they were slowly learning without rehearsal. Evenings remained calm, the sound of wind outside blending with the crackling fire and the quiet rhythm of pages turning. Jack started heading out earlier, returning with supplies he didn't comment on. A better bar of soap, seeds wrapped in thick brown paper, a new enamel mug he placed beside hers without saying it was for her. Nora, in turn, began organizing the small room they used as a pantry, cleaning the shelves, lining up jars, labeling things that had once been stored in improvisation. Sometimes Jack would stand there watching her for a few moments without interrupting, and when she noticed, he would look away and go back to his work. Neither of them talked about what they were feeling, but it was already clear that this marriage, even if born of pressure, was no longer frozen in place. It was reshaping itself through the smallest details. One afternoon, Jack returned from the trail with a basket of pine cones and dry leaves. He said the path to the stream was clear and asked if she wanted to come. Nora grabbed her coat without hesitation. They walked side by side along the narrow trail, trees on either side showing cracks in the ice. Birds were beginning to sing again, still tentative. When they reached the stream, they sat on a wide stone where the sunlight filtered gently through the branches. Jack mentioned they would soon need to reinforce the back fence, and that maybe they could build a chicken coop. Nora listened carefully and, without thinking much, asked if he had always lived there. Jack said he had bought the cabin years earlier with his wife, that she had liked the quiet and the view of the hill, that after she became ill, it had been hard to stay, but harder to leave. So he stayed. Nora didn't interrupt. She didn't know the name of his late wife. Jack didn't say it, and she didn't ask. But something in the way he spoke, without forced emotion or lingering sorrow, made it all feel genuine. When they returned to the cabin, the silence between them carried more meaning, but it wasn't heavy. That night, Nora prepared the meal with more care. She used spices she usually left aside, set the table with 2 plates aligned and napkins folded neatly. Jack noticed but didn't comment. He sat as he always did, ate slowly. When he finished, he got up, took the pot to the sink, and washed the dishes while she dried. Before bed, Jack laid out the bedroll by the fireplace, as he did every night. But this time, when Nora turned out the light in the bedroom, she didn't fall asleep right away. She lay still, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the wood crackling in the other room and the quiet rustle of the blanket being adjusted. And she thought, without urgency, that maybe what they were building didn't need to be put into words. It only needed to keep taking shape, day after day, with the same care she gave to mopping the floor, or he gave to securing nails in the fence. Small things, done with intention, slowly becoming a life that no longer felt borrowed. That week, the thaw began to show more visible signs. The sound of water running along the edges of the trail grew louder. The trees dripped under the morning sun, and the path to the stream revealed patches of earth that had been buried under white for weeks. Nora noticed a shift in the rhythm of the cabin. Jack was waking earlier, leaving more often, speaking more. Not much, but enough for words to begin filling the spaces that once belonged only to gestures. He talked about the weather, the land, the wood that needed replacing. She replied, added her own thoughts, smiled. The conversations stopped being strictly practical and took on a lighter tone. In the silences between them, there was a new energy that both recognized, though neither of them gave it a name. On Friday afternoon, Jack came back from the village with new tools and a sack of grain. He was sweaty, his hair stuck to his forehead, his shirt unbuttoned at the cuffs. Nora was baking bread when he stepped in, and the smell filled the room. He passed by her with a quiet, "smells good," which was enough to bring color to her cheeks. It wasn't a casual compliment. It was a simple remark, said in a tone that lingered long after he went to wash his hands. By the time he returned, she had already set the table. They sat, they ate, they talked, and when the bread was gone, Nora got up to clear the plates. Jack stayed seated for a few moments, staring at his hands. When she came back, he was still there. "Do you regret it?" he asked suddenly, without warning. She froze mid-step, looked at him, her eyes narrowed. Regret what? Staying? Accepting all this? Nora sat down again. It took her a few seconds to reply. No, I didn't know what I was stepping into. But I don't regret where things are now. He nodded. Neither do I. That was the closest they had come to expressing any kind of feeling. And even though they hadn't touched, that quiet admission settled between them with a weight of something understood. Jack stood after that, stepped out onto the porch, and stared at the forest for a long time. Nora stayed at the table, her fingers locked in her lap. The sun dipped lower, casting orange along the edges of the window. The scent of bread still hung in the air. The heat from the stove was fading. When Jack came back inside, his face looked more relaxed. He sat again, this time closer. Not right next to her, but not far either. "The back fence needs fixing. Can you help me tomorrow?" he asked. "I can," she said, and this time he didn't thank her. He just looked in her eyes longer than he needed to. On Saturday, they spent the morning outside. Jack showed her how to use the tools, where to set the nails, how to check the slope of the ground. Nora listened carefully, but the space between them kept narrowing. At one point, while trying to hold a board steady, she lost her balance, and he grabbed her arm. The touch was firm and quick, but her eyes immediately lifted to his. For a moment, neither of them moved. The sound of the forest faded. He didn't let go right away, and she didn't pull back. When he finally did, it was slowly. They both knew what had just happened. It was no longer a possibility. They had felt it clearly for what it was. Later in the afternoon, back inside, Jack took off his shoes and sat on the floor to clean the tools. Nora made tea. When she handed him the mug, he touched her hand, and this time the contact lingered. Neither of them smiled, but there was warmth in his eyes, and her response was one of quiet acceptance. Night fell slowly. The cabin fell into stillness, but everything around them had changed. Their routines, the cold, the books, the small daily movements were all subtly shifting. Something deeper was taking shape, something neither of them had expected to carry, but now felt undeniable. Sunday dawned with a clear sky, and the ice around the cabin had begun to melt, forming small puddles on the more exposed patches of ground. The sound of water dripping from the roof had become part of the day's quiet music. Jack left early to check the trail, and Nora stayed inside, folding clothes, cleaning the stove, organizing the cupboards he rarely opened. When he returned, she was on the porch, a blanket over her legs, her gaze lost among the bare branches of the trees. Jack stopped at the step, rested his hands on his knees, and watched her for a moment before sitting beside her. They stayed there without speaking, just sharing the moment. Later, he came in and lit the fire. She went to the kitchen to prepare something to eat. They moved close, nearly touching, their steps falling into rhythm without effort. As they set the table, their eyes met. Jack said that life felt less difficult with her there. Nora replied with a quiet smile and said that, despite everything, the silence in that place didn't weigh on her. Jack nodded and gently touched her hand, this time not pulling away. Nora didn't retreat. She held his fingers with quiet firmness, and for a few seconds, neither of them moved. There was more between them than words could capture. That night, with the fire low and the wind whispering through the cracks in the walls, Nora slowly approached the bedroll where Jack lay. He looked up and saw her standing there, hands folded in front of her, face calm but sure. She sat beside him and asked if he believed what they were building could be real. Jack said it already was. Nora nodded and placed her hand on his chest. Jack pulled her closer with steady care. They looked into each other's eyes, their bodies close, breaths quickening. Then he kissed her. The kiss came slowly, without urgency, as if it had existed long before it reached the surface. They made love right there, on the wooden floor, with the warmth of the fireplace beside them and the world far away. It was slow, intentional, made of small gestures and glances that said more than anything they could have spoken. There was no hesitation, just two bodies learning to recognize one another, two hearts accepting the possibility of living side by side, with no debts and no disguises. Afterward, they lay quietly, their fingers intertwined, eyes open, listening to the soft crackle of the fire. Jack asked if she was all right. Nora said she had never felt so safe. The days that followed filled with small gestures that changed everything. The path to the stream slowly cleared, revealing footprints made side by side. The trail no longer felt like exile. It became a daily walk where they talked about simple things said with clarity, reinforcing the roof before the next rain, trying to grow mint and rosemary in the garden, choosing a new iron kettle to replace the cracked one. Practical plans, but full of care, as if each decision were a way of saying, I'm staying. The books no longer passed between them in silence. Now they came with notes, marked pages, shared laughter about characters and stories. Sometimes they read aloud, taking turns, sitting close enough for their shoulders to touch naturally. Meals were no longer divided. They were made together, Jack chopping vegetables while Nora mixed in the spices. The house's rhythm had become a shared construction, where everything was noticed, everything cared for. The cloths were always clean, the axe always sharp, the firewood stacked, the socks mended, the bread warmed to just the right degree. Evenings brought a low fire, teacups side by side, bodies drawn closer. The blanket on the sofa was shared without thought, feet brushing and staying there. There were no more questions inside the cabin. What had begun as survival had become companionship. What had been silence was now presence. And everything, from the sound of a spoon scraping the bottom of a pan to footsteps on the porch, carried the sound of connection. By the end of the month, they decided to go to the village together to buy seeds. They walked into the store shoulder to shoulder, and the way they looked at each other said more than any explanation. Conversations around them quieted for a moment, but not for long. Those still gossiping did so out of habit in hushed tones. Others, quieter now, offered genuine smiles. Jack stopped at the blacksmith, carefully chose some tools, asked for advice. Nora bought a piece of delicate blue fabric and asked the seamstress to teach her a new stitch. She spoke with more confidence, looked people in the eye, took her time to say thank you. The village was no longer a threat. It had become the backdrop for what they were slowly building. They returned home with light bags, but each item carried purpose, usefulness, meaning. The looks they exchanged on the way back to the cabin carried something familiar. There was partnership now, and something beyond mere adaptation. That night, while they organized the pantry, laughing at a torn bag of flour and how the sugar had scattered, Jack paused, wiped his hands on the apron, and looked directly at Nora. He said he knew nothing about their story had started the way it should have, but that he wouldn't change a thing. Nora answered without hesitation, her voice steady and calm, that some roots only take hold when they find resistance in the soil. That she hadn't imagined ending up here, but she couldn't see herself anywhere else now. Jack stepped closer, wrapped his arms around her waist, and the two stood there, embraced among shelves, glass jars, and sacks of food. The soft lamplight wrapped around them, and the warmth of that moment was enough. They no longer needed to run from the memories of how things had begun or fear what they might become. They already knew what they were. Two people pushed together by someone else's decision who had learned to stay by their own. And in the quiet of the cabin, between the day's tasks and the laughter at sunset, there was room for everything that was real. Because now, there was truth between them. And truth, they had learned together, is the only foundation that doesn't collapse when the snow comes. The end. What did you think of this story? Let us know in the comments, and tell us where you're watching from. See you next time.